Lab 4 in Uniform Bio 242 is a histology and review of the organs of the endocrine system. So what it gives us a chance is to do a little review of the brain that we did in 241. So when you're looking at this half section, recall that this area right here is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland that sits below it by releasing hormones that increase the activity of cells in the pituitary and inhibiting hormones that inhibit the cells in the pituitary. The pituitary itself, which is this gland we see here sitting in the sella turcica, the hypophyseal fossa of the sphenoid bone, is divided into an anterior portion, the anterior pituitary, and a posterior portion, the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary has a direct connection to the anterior pituitary via the stalk, which is called the infundibulum. And we have neurosecretory cells that are in our hypothalamus whose axons travel down through the infundibulum and the hypophyseal hypophyseal thalamic tract to the posterior pituitary. And where in their terminal ends they release two hormones, ADH that we covered when we did the urinary system, antidiuretic hormone that concentrates your urine, conserves water in the body, and oxytocin that is released during childbirth that creates the uterine contractions, and then later during lactation that creates milk letdown. The anterior pituitary doesn't have a direct connection, but is connected via a vascular supply. We have a capillary bed in the hypothalamus where releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones enter the blood, travel down through the hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary where they target cells. We divide cells in the anterior pituitary into two groups, acidophils, which are somatotrophs and lactotrophs, and then basophils, which are corticotrophs, gonadotrophs, and thyrotrophs. So each of these group of cells then produce hormones. So somatotrophs produce human growth hormone, lactotrophs produce prolactin, thyrotrophs produce TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone, gonadotrophs produce LH, follicle stimulating hormone, LH, which is luteinizing hormone, and FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. And then corticotrophs produce melanocyte stimulating hormone and adrenal corticotrophic hormone. Now these hormones released to the anterior pituitary travel in the blood to the body where they then interact with other endocrine organs in a pathway pattern. So as we're looking for other endocrine organs, then we have a thyroid gland that we can see in the neck. And as we look in the internal environment, and we can remove some of these organs, then if we remove the stomach, then we have an organ that sits behind the stomach, which is the pancreas. And the pancreas has specialized areas in it that we call islets of Langerhans that we're going to come back and talk about. And then if we look posterior to the pancreas, sitting on top of the kidney here, we can actually see the adrenal gland. And then depending upon the gender, and for this model it's female, then we have ovaries that we see in the pelvic cavity here. And then if we had a male model, then we would have the testes. We would have the testes associated with the scrotum that are impacted by that. So when we look at the thyroid gland, and you look at the thyroid gland under the microscope, then we'll have two populations of cells. Cells that are between these round structures called follicles, which are parafollicular cells, and they release calcitonin, which is a hormone that causes calcium deposition in bone, so it decreases blood calcium. And then we have the follicular cells, which surround the follicles, which produce T3 and T4. So the hormone from the anterior pituitary, TSH, targets the follicular cells and controls their production of T3 and T4. Now, as we move downward and we put the organs kind of back in place here for a moment, then we have our pancreas. And recall, most of the pancreas is digestive in function, but we have little islands of cells that we call islets of Langerhans that you can see under a microscope in the pancreas. And the islets of Langerhans contain 4 cell populations: alpha cells that produce glucagon, beta cells that produce insulin, delta cells that produce somatostatin, and F cells that produce pancreatic polypeptide. And they are not controlled by the anterior pituitary. Now, if we remove this again so that we can see our adrenal glands sitting on top of the kidneys, then remember that the adrenal glands are divided into the more superficial tissue, which is the adrenal cortex, and a tissue that would be deep in the adrenal gland called the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla releases norepinephrine and epinephrine, highest amounts of epinephrine, which are parasympathetic neurotransmitters circulating in the blood like hormones. The adrenal cortex can be subdivided into zones, and so the outermost zone would be the zona glomerulosus. Just inside of that would be the zona fasciculata, and then inside of that, going toward the medulla, would be the zona reticularis. So the zona glomerulosus produces mineralocorticoids. The one we covered in the kidney would be aldosterone. That affects principal cells and water reabsorption, sodium reabsorption. The zona fasciculata produces hormones that are called glucocorticoids. The most common would be cortisone and cortisol, which are stress hormones, anti-inflammatory hormones, which is why we use shots to decrease inflammation in the body. And it's the one that's best understood, its connection between the anterior pituitary and the release of hormones, with ACTH controlling their release. And then the inner zone, the zona reticularis, produces small amounts of androgen-like compounds called DHEA or dihydroepiandrosterone, which are responsible for libido, sex drive in both men and women, and energy levels. Now, as we move down into the pelvis, then on either side here we have an ovary. And the ovary is stimulated by luteinizing hormone coming from the pituitary gland and follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, coming from the pituitary gland. FSH causes follicular development and the development of an egg in the first 14 days of an ovarian cycle. Luteinizing hormone causes ovulation at about day 14 in an ovarian cycle. As the egg develops, the cells around the egg in a follicle produce higher amounts of estrogen in the first 14 days of an ovarian cycle. And then post-ovulation, the follicle degenerates into a corpus luteum that produces higher amounts of progesterone in the second 14 days of an ovarian cycle. As the corpus luteum degenerates into a corpus albicans, then progesterone levels drop, and that sets a woman up for her next period. Now, if we look at the testes, and then luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone also affect the testes. Luteinizing hormone affects cells called cells of Leydig that produce testosterone. And then we have to have an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase that converts testosterone into a more potent form of the hormone called dihydrotestosterone. And follicle stimulating hormone targets cells in synapse tubules called Sertoli cells that then produce a compound called androgen binding peptide, or APP, that then controls sperm production. So the commonality between the genders is follicle stimulating hormone causes the formation of an egg and controls the formation of sperm. So that concludes our overview of the endocrine system, and you're going to spend quite a bit of time in lab not looking at the organs themselves, but actually looking at them under a microscope and looking at the specific cells that produce the hormones that we just talked about.